Why is it so hard to respond? I'm not big on Oracle, I'm super Oracle. So I hate it. I triple this. Yeah, I've been Oracle hard a lot of times. That's what I like when I deleted this from my phone. I did something.
Alright, so let us attack the final and most interesting explanation for outbreak of war. So we assumed more or less explicitly that both actors are fully informed about the characteristic of war, in the sense that they agree about the relative military strength, which determines the probability to win for each side, and they also share knowledge about the cost of war for each party. So it is a situation in which information is incomplete but symmetric, in the sense that there is a random event that determines the outcome of war. So in this sense there is no complete information, but it is symmetric in the sense that they have access to the same pieces of knowledge and therefore come to the same conclusions. So indeed, if both players or both states have access to the same knowledge, they should come also to the same, they should reach the same conclusions and agree about the parameters of the model, especially P, CA, and CB. So, however, historically, it seems that this was very often not the case, and this was a very important factor that determined the outbreak of war. So this we call private information, because typically this asymmetry of opinions about how war would develop is related to the fact that one party has much better information about its own situation than the other party has about one's own situation. So, in economics terms, we would say that the type of the player is known to the player, but not to the opponent. So each party has private information about their own military strength, their own willingness to fight. The willingness to fight is proxied by the cost of war. The smaller the cost, the higher the willingness to fight. Whereas military power is proxied by P, the probability to win. So as was mentioned before, military conflicts are extremely hard to forecast how they will develop. So, will new weapons be developed? Will the population in one country maybe revolt against their own government because the population doesn't want to carry the burdens of war anymore? So it is extremely difficult. But the main point is that once that they share some ideas about the laws that determine those social behaviors, plus other natural laws, including the uncertainties related to those laws, the parties should get to the same conclusion, so that the situation would be incomplete but symmetric information. But in reality, very often people or states have private information, and we will discuss this, we will give examples in a moment. especially both world wars were triggered to a large extent by the fact that there was this type of private expansion. So now, as a start, however, we want to show the mechanism in formal mathematical terms. So let us start with the asymmetry of information with respect to military power. So, asymmetry of information with respect to military power. So, this was very important, for instance, in the Russian-Japanese War of 904. 904, there was in East Asia a big war between Russia, Tsarist Russia, and Japan. And the Russians, at the outset, or before the war started, they were sure they would win, because in that time, no single European army had been defeated by an Asian army. But the Japanese thought that they had a 50-50% probability to win the war. So the sum of probabilities was not one, it was much larger than one. So it showed that there was overconfidence, and history showed that the Russians were overconfident because they lost the war. So in this framework, we can say, well, because of different access to information, each country knows only in probabilistic terms the probability to win. And the interesting case is the one of overconfidence, in which each country has a larger thinks that his probability to win is larger than the probability to win assigned to it by the opponent. So this could be a situation in which the expected probability to win for country A, which you remember P is the probability to win. Here we have an expectation about the probability to win. So the expectation of A about the parameter P is relatively large, so larger compared to the expectation of B about the value of P. Is to say, country B thinks, well, actually, I have a large probability to win, and country A thinks I have a large probability to win. And then, using the standard analytic method, we assume that they know about CA and CB. This means that from the viewpoint of A, well, they would say the bargaining range that would make us both better off as compared to war is here, is this one. But according to B, this is not true. The true bargaining range, according to B's knowledge, is here. And they do not overlap in this example. So that in this case, it would be extremely hard to find a settlement. Because if you propose something here, for instance, then, well, country A would say, no, not at all. Given my military strength, I demand at least this X here. This is the minimum I can accept in a settlement. I would never accept this. And by the same token, even B would never accept this because from its viewpoint, the worst it can accept is this point here. So, in this case, it seems that an agreement is not possible. And something similar can happen if there is uncertainty about the cost of war. This is this case here. Here we assume now that military strength is known by both, so that each one can locate P. However, here we have private information about the cost of war. So, in the case of country A knows that its cost of wars are CA, has only some expectation about the cost of war for the opponent, and it overestimates them. So it thinks that they are very large, that they are like this. These are the expectation of the costs of war in country B, expectation held by country A. So that according to country A, the range of Pareto improving agreements is this one, between P minus CA and P plus the expectation of CB. For country B knows its own costs and has only an expectation about the cost for country A, and it overestimates them. So that for country B, the range of agreements that are meaningful is this one. So they overlap in this case, but still you see that if, for instance, you would focus on the Nash bargaining solution, which means dividing the surplus by half, then of course these subjective focal points are very far apart from each other, so that it would be difficult to find a settlement. So these are.
Can you explain the last point a bit more? How do they differ then?
So, for instance, assume that there is a accepted fairness criterion that says that you should split by half the surplus, and you are country A. For you, the range is given by this, between P minus CA and P plus expectation of CB. So the middle of this interval will be, say, relatively to the right of P, much to the right of P. Now, for country B, the bargaining range, that is the set of all allocations such that both prefer that allocation to the fallback option of war, is given by this, between P minus expectation of CA and P plus CB. And you see that the middle of this interval is to the left of P, quite a lot to the left. So you have that the two focal points are very far apart from each other. So this is a not very precise discussion of the difficulty, but it is a very important one in economic theory. It's a very important one in economic theory because it is also a difficulty that arises every time in which a buyer and a seller meet, and they have private information about the valuation of the object, so that the seller does not know exactly what the valuation for the buyer is, and the buyer does not know for the seller. And then they should find an agreement. And in a very famous paper, it was shown that there exists no, under certain regularity conditions, there exists no bargaining procedure that lead to efficient exchange of an object if there is private information. And this is similar here. And so this requires some technical development that is known in economics as mechanism design. And since this is a very important topic, we will deal with this in one of the next classes. So a priori it seems to be an impossible task because the space of all possible procedures is not well defined, and you maximize over a space that is not well defined, so standard topological concepts do not apply. But there are some means to solve the problem. So for today, what is important is to understand that this asymmetry of information can lead to different opinions about what is acceptable for both parties, and this can lead indeed to the failure of bargaining, failure of finding a text. So there are a couple of questions that are important. So first question, are there historical examples where so asymmetric information was reported like here? So one that I mentioned was the Russian-Japanese War of 1904. So and this led to the war. The First World War. So according to many historians, in the July crisis, when Austria was to decide to attack, to declare war to Serbia, the Russians did announce that they would defend Serbia, but the Germans, that were, to speak, the important actors on the other side, more than the Austrians, did not believe that the Russians would indeed defend Serbia. So that they encouraged Austria to attack Serbia because they thought that Russia was not going to enter the conflict. And this was because they underestimated the willingness to fight of the Russians. And even later on, they did not believe that France and Britain would enter the First World War. Similarly, Hitler, when he attacked Poland, did not believe that the announcements made by Britain and France would be credible. No? So they miscalculated in all these cases. No? They miscalculated. So the Russians miscalculated in the Russian-Japanese War, and the Germans miscalculated twice in the world wars. Not a very good score. Yes.
But is it miscalculation, or is it just that states aren't able to know what is their probability, what are their they know what they have, but
Yes.
they're sort of guessing more what the opponent has.
Well, if they play mixed strategies, you mean, so, but I don't think that they use dice in order to choose whether to go to war or not, so, yes, their forecast was wrong, I think. So,
But that relates to my point that I made before, where you said we go back to this point at private information. I think maybe the Germans did not just miscalculate, maybe the Britons and the French did not know at this point if they would enter. And that later they entered was due to certain circumstances in the world that happened that no party knew before.
yes, but as long as this is symmetric, incomplete information, they should agree on this, and then they should find a settlement such that both are better off. This is the logical consequence. So it's only if there is some asymmetry in information. So this can lead to asymmetry of probability distribution. So that each one has a different probability distributions about some state of the world that will occur in the future. But you have to have some private information whatsoever.
I think it's more about not only private information, but also about information that no side has. And if you say, okay, that they could share
Yes,
a few of the words,
parts of it.
I think it can be impossible. I mean, it can be impossible that I share my view of the world, of the uncertainties of the world that are dependent on thousand variables. I cannot tell you about this because it's more a feeling. Maybe.
So let me then come. This is very strongly related to this question, to this problem. No? So if however complicated the world is, we should agree that two rational individuals that are given precisely the same information about the laws of nature, about the randomness of everything and so on, they should reach the same conclusion and then have the same probability distribution about future events. How complicated how it can be. It can be extremely complicated, but if they are rational, so that they can use logic and facts in the same way, they should reach the same conclusion. This is a standard result in the theory of decision making. So either the actors are to some extent irrational, but this we dealt with already at the beginning, so this was the first explanation. Now we are assuming that they are rational. So if they are rational and they have access to the same information, they should reach the same conclusion. There should be no private information. So there should be no different opinions about P or CA, CP. So now let us assume that indeed there is some private information so that they arrive at different beliefs. So knowing that this difference of beliefs can lead to war, why don't they simply share all the information they have so that they reach the same conclusions about the relevant parameter, in this model, the military strength and the cost of war. If they are free to share it, if they are free to share it, and in this case, war is avoided. So this is the issue, the question. And there are a couple of answers that are pretty convincing why this did not happen in many cases, like in the Russo-Japanese War. So, a first general obstacle to sharing information and avoiding private information is that private information can be used strategically, in the sense that it can be used in order to improve the outcome of bargaining for each side. So typically, this you know also, if you go to the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul, and then they want to sell you something, and then you say, this, oh no, so expensive, no, I would never pay so much for this, no. Actually, you think, well, I would pay, but I know that he would sell it also for much less, and then you bargain, and you misrepresent your willingness to pay. And the same is for the seller. Seller says, no, but I'm doing a lot of, losing a lot of money if I sell this only for, no, I will never sell it. So you think, actually, I am doing a profit also on this, but I could make more. So that is, every side has an incentive to misrepresent the situation, risking the breakup of the settlement, risking that I go away from the shop and the bazaar and I do not buy, because this probability of breaking the negotiation is offset by my hope to get a better deal. So it's a gamble also like this. You misrepresent, and this is the same in international relations. So with the particular additional feature that is not there in the market, in the bazaar. So, like in the bazaar, you have the incentive to overestimate your own strength, military strength, and to say that casualties are not so important for me, and 300 million Chinese dead is not that bad. So, but on the other side, you want also not to appear as the aggressor in international relations. So this is a bit of a counter effect, because if you play the role of the strong man who would win the war very rapidly, and then it comes to a war, then it's likely that the other countries internationally will say, well, this is the aggressor and it should be punished. So this is a bit of a, so this limits a bit your incentive to exaggerate your probability to win and to subestimate your casualties in case of war. So this is one aspect of the why they do not share information. The other one is more specific to military situations, and this is the explanation also for the Russian-Japanese war. So, and this is the case, is the situation that arises at the moment in which, when you reveal your actual military strength, in order to make it credible, you have to transmit information that actually can be used by the enemy in order to reduce your probability to win. So that P is endogenous to the information that you give. And this was the case in the Russian-Japanese war. So in the Russian-Japanese war, so the Russian, so they quarreled about Manchuria and Korea. And the Tsar, for the Tsar, it was not so important. So actually, it was more interested in European international relations. So that East Asia was considered a second order importance. But still, they wanted to take the most from that territory. And in 1903, the Japanese offered a lot of several settlements, but the Russians thought that they would be so much more powerful in military terms that they would deserve a much better settlements. So, for instance, Russia was A and Japan was B. So, and the Japanese said that, well, let's go for 50-50, x equal 1/2, but the Russian said, no, 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 no. My P is so large that I want 1 minus epsilon, epsilon very small. So the Japanese, however, had a secret plan for a first strike against the Russian. The Japanese had reformed the Japanese armed forces, had made a lot of training, and they have reorganized the army, and they had very good intelligence. So spies that had remarked where the Russian troops were, how you could attack them, and thanks to this knowledge, they had a secret plan for a first strike attack that led the Japanese chief commanders to tell the Emperor of Japan that the chance to win the war in case of a first attack, what we will call preemptive attack next time, was 50-50. But so, if Japan would have said to the Russian, look, we are much better than what you think, so that is why we should settle in the middle and not here, the Russian would have think it's fluff. It's just cheap talk. I don't believe you, so show me. But if they would have shown, they would have shown the secret attack plans, and then the Russian could have avoided them by defending where the Japanese were going to attack. So that it was not feasible to share information without reducing so much the bargaining power of Japan that virtually they would have landed again in a very bad situation. So that in cases like this, there is no rational sharing of information. There is no disclosure of private information. And then we are again in the case we had before, where with overconfidence, like in the Russian-Japanese war, you end in war. So, what is the standard alternative to information sharing in a situation like that? Okay.
Yeah, I think these are very valid points, these 2 points that probably are true in the most cases. But I would add this third point that I made before, that sometimes your personal information is so complex and even partly subconscious that you cannot fully explain it to the other party. So in a way, I would say that the standard result of decision-making theory is not always realistic.
Yes, it may be very cumbersome to transmit all relevant information, but actually what we need is just to transmit enough information such that, like in the example before, there is some overlapping of the bargaining ranges. So, as always in economics, so we talk about Pareto efficiency, but so of course Pareto efficiency is just the extreme of a range of desirable allocation. So what we mean in reality is that we come close to that.
Maybe as an example, I don't know much about the conflict, but in the Second World War, the British tried to convince the Americans to join the war against Germany and Japan. And I think it was not clear that the American would join. And if they had discussed this, like the British with the German at the beginning of the war, I mean, this should have meant that the British should try to give every information that they have about their secret service, how they could influence maybe the Americans, but they would even themselves did not
This is
know.
like the second point here, like the Japanese
This comes
telling
into play. This comes into play, but also, let's say we say they in a parallel world or in an imaginary world that the British want to give all the information and the Germans want to give all the information because they want to make a bargain, and they both do not pay attention to these 2 points. Let's say they really want to give their information. Then it would be super difficult still for the British to give all the information that would influence if they can influence the Americans or not. So this is my point. Because the war sometimes goes over many years and many things can happen. And
if they are really like you assumed, they can say, well, I think they, in some points, they also try during the Cold War. So come to our, send your generals to our meetings, so that they live. So U.S. generals in the Kremlin and Soviet generals in Washington, and they participate in the meetings, and they can have access to our computers and so on. And then they really get the same P.
And then still you might have a feeling about how your population wants to fight or not in certain cases, and this is difficult to tell the other party.
Yes.
Even if those 2 points are, let's say, ignored.
Yes, this is something that I wanted to come to this, which is so in situation in which you have private information and you cannot share it in this way, and you are not believed because they think that you are bluffing, what you typically can do is to signal. The theory of signaling. So in economics, for instance, if you go to the labor market, you know the Spence model. Spence got the Nobel Prize for this. So the firm a priori would not know about your productivity, but you have been at the FU Berlin and got a master's degree, and this is a signal that your productivity is high, and then you get a higher wage. So a signal is a costly action that signals your private information about your productivity because it separates you from different types. So you are ready to carry the cost of a master at the FU Berlin, but people who are not as clever as you would not carry the cost because it would last 10 years before they got the master. So, and then here something similar could work, in the sense that you may try to signal that you are very powerful in military terms. And what are the costly actions that you can do in order to signal this? Because if you can convince your opponent by some signals that you are very powerful, then you can agree on P, on the relative military power, and then you can get to a settlement. The problem is that in order to signal military strength, typically you do things that really increase the probability to have a war. Because you signal it by what? By showing weapons, big sophisticated weapons, but then you have to build them, and this may also increase probability of war. Maybe you mobilize troops in order to show how many soldiers you have, but with so many troops, it is possible that some starts a war, maybe without even your consent. Or you may create domestic political cost to setting back. To say, so for instance, to tell your electorate or your citizens, we demand that they give us that territory, or that they do not enter NATO, or that something. And you insist on this so that on the one hand you transmit, you create a cost by retreating. You create a cost by retreating, so that the opposite side knows that actually you have a strong commitment, and this can signal that indeed you are very strong, because you are ready to risk war. But of course, if you commit too much, then if something random happens, then it is very difficult to retreat, and then you come maybe to war. So that signaling is also problematic in this type of disputes. So in the media these days we always find out on signaling. So I think yesterday or the day before yesterday there was this announcement by Putin that they have a new missile. And of course the European Union in the last month has done a lot of investment in rearmament and drafting people to army in various countries, so to signal its willingness to fight. So it can get to a better deal, but it can also increase the risk of actual war. So it seems that this interpretation of war as stemming from situations in which a bargain cannot be reached because of private information is a very important one. And this is why we will deal with this issue also in the future. But the next time we will deal with the case of no commitment, which entails looking at intertemporal models, where there is some dynamic, like the Thucydides trap between Sparta and Athens, where Sparta feared the growing military might of Athens and then attacked Athens. It's like US and China today. Okay. Questions or remarks? Then I wish you a nice evening, and we see in 2 weeks.
Hey,